Hi, everyone. Welcome back to She Barb's podcast. Today's guest is Howard Bloom. Hi, Howard.
Hi, Brooke. How are you?
Thank you for coming on our podcast. I'm great. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm a huge fan.
Oh, thanks, Brooke.
So, can you tell our listeners a little bit about your newest release, Einstein, Michael Jackson, and Me?
Well, yes. Um, I have a very strange career. I started out in theoretical physics and microbiology at the age of 10.
Wow.
I built my first Boolean algebra machine and co-designed a computer that won science fair awards when I was 12. And I came up with a theory of the beginning, middle, and end of the universe that predicted something that wouldn't be discovered for 37 years, dark energy, when I was 16 years old and working at the world's largest cancer research facility. Um, and I had nothing to do with popular culture. Popular culture was the culture of the kids who used to chase me around the block and snatch my hat and throw it back and forth above my head and generally try to humiliate me. So I wanted to have nothing to do with it.
Mhm.
And then when I graduated from NYU, I graduated magna cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa, and I had 4 fellowships in what's today called neuroscience,
Mhm.
a field that didn't quite exist yet. And I had a sudden realization that if I went to grad school, it would be Auschwitz for the mind.
Wow.
Um, in other words, since the age of 12, I've been fascinated by the ecstatic experience, by the most intense religious experiences. I'm an atheist.
Oh.
Um, and I was not going to get anywhere near those passionate experiences. Oh, God. So there's a mild frog in my throat. So maybe it's not a mild frog. Maybe it's a serious frog. But at any rate, um, so it seemed to me that it's an obligation of science to dive into the realms of the unknown. And
Mhm.
the ecstatic experience was not only a realm of the unknown, but it was connected at the hip to the forces of history. At least
Oh.
that's what I thought. And that's what William James, the founder of American psychology and the author of the book, The Varieties of the Religious Experience, he thought
Wow.
that too. So I suddenly realized if I go to grad school, I'm going to be giving paper and pencil tests to 22 college students at a time. And how often is the ecstatic experience going to rear its head in that room? Never, never. I would be isolated from the kind of phenomena that I was most interested in. So I called Columbia University and I said I'll be coming a year late. And I had an opportunity to start an art studio with a bunch of friends. And I started the art studio, and the art studio became the most successful. I mean, the first year we earned $75 a piece per week. Um, we were really scraping the first year, but my job was to keep these artists from starving.
Mhm.
And I ended up inventing a new animation technique for NBC,
Wow.
doing all of the graphics for ABC's 7 FM stations when they were transitioning into a really iffy new radio format. It was called progressive radio. It was rock radio, where a
Wow.
DJ, instead of playing just the top 40, could play a whole album if he wanted. He could play anything he wanted. Um, and a bunch, I was on the cover of Art Direction magazine.
Wow.
And then I was offered a chance to edit a magazine. I had edited the literary magazine at NYU, and it had been and I turned it into an experimental graphics and literary magazine, which is how I met the starving artists with whom I started the art studio. And when I was 12 years old, a girl in 8th grade had turned her eyes toward me, and I suddenly realized nobody ever looked at me. And then she did something even more startling. She made eye contact with me, which nobody had ever done. And she said, I told my mom you understand the theory of relativity. And Brooke, I did not understand the theory of relativity, but I was not going to admit that because, the kids avoided me, but they at least had a name for me, the sickly scientist. I needed to live up. I needed to live up to that name. So I was reading 2 books a day in those days, mostly science and science fiction. Well, I jumped on my bicycle as soon as school was over. I pedaled over to the local library. I rushed in. The librarians literally knew me better than my mother did. And I said, give me everything you've got on the theory of relativity. And they rummaged through the stacks and they found a great big fat book by Einstein and two collaborators and a little tiny skinny book by Einstein himself. So I put those in my bicycle clamp. I pedaled for home as fast as I could. And I sat up in my bedroom reading the big fat book because I had learned that if you do things the hardest way possible, you don't think you're going to understand anything. You don't think you are understanding anything. But by the time you get to the end of a book, you've understood something. So I got 50 pages into that book. Now, Brooke, it was only about 7 words of English per page, and the rest was mathematical equations. And I've never been good with mathematical equations. So 8 o'clock at night came. I realized that I only had 2 hours left in which to understand the theory of relativity or be humiliated at school the next day. I had to give up on the big fat book, and I went to the little skinny book. And in the little skinny book, Albert Einstein, in an introduction, it felt as if he had reached out through the pages of the book and grabbed me by the lapels, and pulled my nose up to his, and said, Schmuck, listen up. To be a genius, it is not enough to come up with a theory that only 7 men in the world can understand. To be a genius, you have to be able to come up with that theory and then explain it so clearly that anyone with a college education or a high school education and a reasonable degree of intelligence can understand it. So Albert Einstein, when I was 12 years old, gave me my marching orders that to be an original scientific thinker, I was going to need to be an author. So there I was with the art studio, and I brought in an account called the National Lampoon, a magazine that was just about to get started. And then my artists, half of them voted me out of the studio because they had this big check coming in from the National Lampoon every month, and they didn't want to give me a percentage. And there was one incompetent artist in the group. I had to have him in there because my most brilliant artist insisted on him as a sidekick. And this was a ploy of the incompetent artist to take over the art direction of the National Lampoon. And now all of a sudden I was free after 3 years putting this art studio on the map. Meanwhile, I had been writing for small magazines. One day I used to co-design some of my own clothes. And so one day I went up to the big loft where a new underground fashion magazine bankrolled by Baron Woolman, the guy who bankrolled Rolling Stone, was getting started. And I came out of the freight elevator, which is the only elevator they had because this was an industrial building, and expected to go over to a desk and open my portfolio and see the 3 women in the room ooh and ah over the pictures. And that didn't happen. The minute I walked out of the elevator, their jaws dropped. And they looked at my clothes and they said, do you have more of these? And I said, yes, I've got a whole closet full of them. Why? And they said, do you think you could write an article about them? Wow, Brooke, I had been dying to get into magazines because that's where you learn to write with the clarity and the snap, the vigor that Albert Einstein was telling me was my obligation. So I ended up writing 175 articles for that magazine. They made me a contributing editor. And then another one of the contributing editors started her own new magazine, and she'd ask if I'd be a contributing editor too. And so now I was writing articles for her, but this was my dream. My next step had to be writing for the mass market, writing for magazines, writing so deliciously that once you got started, you couldn't stop reading. That was the goal. My artist had just thrown me out, and I was covering a parapsychology convention, mind readers, spoon benders, people like that, for natural lifestyles. And a kid walked up to me, and he saw the pad of paper in my left hand, and that I was frantically scribbling notes. And he deduced that I was some sort of a journalist. He was right. And he said, would you like to edit a magazine? Now, Brooke, I didn't even ask what kind of magazine this was. I simply said yes, because in order to turn in all these articles to Rags Magazine and Natural Lifestyles, I was getting up at 6 in the morning, going to the manual typewriter, totally naked. It was one of these 1945 Remingtons where you had to smash each key with the force of a sledgehammer. to get it to work. And I was writing for 2 hours, and then I was putting on my clothes, going into the art studio, building the art studio, and coming home at night and sitting with a pot of coffee and writing until 11 o'clock at night. And it was becoming tiring. So editing a magazine, that sounded like a great way to do my writing from 9 to 5 and not have to get up at 6 in the morning. So I said yes, and I was given an appointment with a publisher. And Brooke, you have to remember, in those days, we did not have Google. So if you were about to meet with somebody, you could not look him up. You could not even find the name of the magazine he published without going to the local library. And even then, search engines didn't exist. So you were dead, even if you went to a library. So I went to this meeting, and the publisher said the name of the magazine was Circus. And I thought, okay, I've never liked circuses, clowns, and elephants. But if I love my audience, I can write about anything. And then he said, no, it's not clowns and elephants. It's rock and roll. So that's how I landed in the rock and roll business. And he set me a task. He wanted the magazine to read like Time magazine, and he wanted to have the commercial success of 2 magazines in Europe. One was called Bravo in Germany. The other was called Salut les copains in France. And each of them sold 1 million copies. And the biggest selling rock magazine in the United States, in a market 5 times the size of either France or Germany, sold only 250,000 copies. And my magazine, Circus, was only selling 60,000 copies at that point. And so he set me the task of turning Circus into what all of these 3 combined could accomplish. And it took me a year. And then I came back to him and I said, if you give me sales figures so I can do correlational studies. Remember, I came from science. So I was using the tools that I'd been given by reading Martin Gardner's mathematical games sections in the Scientific American when I was a kid. So if you give me those sales figures, I guarantee you I will increase the sales of the magazine. He hemmed and he hawed. He'd never given sales figures out before. Then he turned them over to me. I worked out the correlations. I came back with a formula for the magazine. He was kind enough to allow me to institute it, to actually put it into motion. And we increased 211% in sales over the course of the next 12 months.
Oh, wow.
And one day, Chet Flippo, one of the founding editors of Rolling Stone, sent me a great big manila envelope. And by messenger. Brooke, you don't send people, unless it's really important stuff, packages by messenger. So I pulled 6 sheets of paper out of the manila envelope and read them. And they were about this munchkin, this Rumpelstiltskin, who was working in a converted broom closet, which is what I was working in at Circus Magazine, and who was turning straw into gold. And it said in these 6 pages that this mysterious person had invented an entirely new magazine genre, the heavy metal magazine. So that's apparently what I did. And then I shared the formula a few years later with the editors of 2 other magazines, Cream and Hit Parader. And all of a sudden, we had a category of heavy metal magazines, all based on the format that I had worked out for the publisher of Circus. And then I was called on, I was asked to found a public and artist relations department for Gulf and Western's 14 record companies, which I did, even though I had no experience in public relations and artist relations. But I'd been on the receiving end of the phone for calls from all the major publicists in the business. And I had gotten, again, to use my scientific approach to analyze what worked and what didn't work. That Gulf and Western's 14 record companies were, all of them with the exception of 2, were failing, and failing badly. So everybody else was being asked to make cutbacks. And I was constantly being given more money. I was being given money to hire one staff member after another staff member after another staff member. And then the company was sold to ABC Records. And the lawyer who had negotiated the sale called me. Well, I don't talk to lawyers. I don't know anything about business. I mean, yeah, I established a successful business in the art business, but that's not my focus. Money is not my focus. And he called me, said, "You know why we were able to sell that pissant little record company to ABC for so much money, don't you?" And I confessed I had no idea. And he said it was because of you. And I said, "No, that's not possible." And he pointed out that I had doubled the value of the company. Why? Because in our 14 record companies, there were two that actually had functioning teams that actually worked. One was Sire Records, founded by Seymour Stein, the guy who would eventually discover Madonna, and his partner Richard Gotterer, the guy who would discover Blondie. And the other was Dot Records, which was number 3 in the country and Western market and was fighting to become number 1. And I admired those teams and I worked my tail off for them. So the lawyer explained when Gulf and Western's record holdings were sold to ABC Records, the president of Dot Records and the president of Sire Records flew out to California and met with the president of ABC Records. And they said that if ABC got rid of you, they would leave.
Oh.
So, because I was strongly increasing the value of those companies.
Wow.
Which, so at any rate, and eventually one day I was sitting in a cubicle at ABC Records, and Seymour Stein, the guy who discovered Madonna, stuck his head into my cubicle and said, "Schmuck, if you're so smart, why don't you have your own company?" Look, you can get me in all kinds of things. I can't throw a ball and I can't catch one. When I go down to the dog beach and the dogs bring a stick over me, hoping I'll throw it into the pond, my throw is so pathetic that it defies belief. I can't do the normal things that most people can do. But the one thing that you can't challenge me on is intelligence. At least I'm fortunate enough to have a modicum of that. And Seymour had challenged my intelligence with his "if you're so smart." So I founded my own PR firm, and I started with somebody at Gulf and Western whose career I had taken from nothing considerably down the road. Her name was Stephanie Mills. She played Dorothy in The Wiz, and she's had about 15 gold records. And I started with ZZ Top, who were a band that the press loathed and despised. And I loved turning around perceptions. If there was something valid to a band that the press was overlooking, I loved showing that validity to the press and telling that story to the press and discovering that story to begin with. And I was named the ambassador of Texas culture to the world by the mayor of Houston. And I was named the unofficial spokesman for the gay community coming out of the closet with a new form of music called disco. And despite the fact that I'm not gay, and I was named those two things in the same month. If the mayor of Houston had known about my being named the spokesman of the gay community, she would have dropped her socks. So, and then we built from there. And I ended up working with Michael Jackson, Prince, Bob Marley, Bette Midler, AC/DC, Aerosmith, Kiss, Queen, Run DMC, Billy Joel, Billy Idol, Paul Simon, Peter Gabriel, David Byrne, ZZ Top, Joan Jett, Shaka Khan, Run DMC, and whole musical movements. Like when I was at Gulf and Western, country and Western was restricted to a ghetto in the Bible Belt. And I helped country and Western go global because there was a strong team of people working on this. And I was able to amplify what that team was able to do or contribute to what that team was able to do. With disco, one of the things I discovered was that musical forms are often the voices of subculture trying to find its identity and express itself and proclaim its right to exist. And that's what country and Western was for the folks in the Bible Belt. That's what disco was for the folks in the gay community. That's what the music of ZZ Top was for Texas culture, which is really a very unique culture, different from just about anything else on planet Earth. And the list goes on and on. Eventually, John Mellencamp would be the voice of the kind of culture that's in Seymour, Indiana, a kind of teen culture. I'd get involved with punk music, which was the voice of a teen generation trying to rebel. which is often music's function. And so, but one of the things I discovered was this: when I was 12 years old and became fascinated with ecstatic religion, one of the things that drove me was an incident. First of all, I discovered I was an atheist. Now, remember, I had been reading 2 books a day of science fiction since I was 10 years old. Um, and But I wasn't able to confess this to myself because I was about to be invited to the first party ever to invite me to enter it in Buffalo, New York, in my lifetime. It was my bar mitzvah. And not only would there be a party, there would be presents. And I could not confess to myself that I was an atheist or I would blow the bar mitzvah. So I stuck that realization off in a corner of my mind where it would be invisible, locked it in a closet, and had my bar mitzvah. And then, and when I finished writing, it took me 2 months to write all the thank you notes for the presents. And when I was finished, I could finally confess to myself that I was an atheist. Now, there's a problem. My bar mitzvah was in June. I finished writing all the notes in August. And in September come the Jewish high holidays, and I'm a Jewish atheist. So my parents weren't observant. They didn't go to the synagogue very often, just when friends' kids were having weddings and bar mitzvahs. But when it came to the high holidays, they were deadly serious. And they somehow got me into a suit. I don't know how they did it because I hated suits. And they got me into their 4-door Fraser blue automobile. And I don't know how they did that either. But when they got me to Richmond Avenue, this great tree-lined cathedral of elms lined avenue, where the synagogue was, that's as far as I would go. So I was holding on to the sturdily made American door frame of the Fraser, and my parents were holding on to my ankles and literally trying to drag me up the street like a sack of meat. And okay, if I'm an atheist, there are no gods in the sky. If I'm an atheist, there are no gods under the ground. But there are gods in this picture. And my parents' passion and their willingness to grind my face to hamburger, dragging me up the sidewalk to the synagogue if they can only detach me from the car frame. And where are the gods in this picture? They're in my parents. And what does that mean? That means if there are gods in the passion of my parents, those gods also exist in me. So one of my jobs as a science person, as a poet, remember, I was the editor of the literary magazine at NYU. We won 2 National Academy of Poets prizes. So, and they thought my poetry would be the next great body of poetry to come out of NYU. So the poet in residence, at least, was under that impression. So as a whatever I am, a human trying to understand everything I could possibly understand, understanding those gods inside and finding the gods inside is essential. And 2 years later, I heard that there was a book called The Varieties of the Religious Experience by William James. And in those days, we didn't have Amazon. And it took me 4 months to track down a copy of the book. And when I got it, it was as if William James was writing specifically for me. And he was laying out the ecstatic experience of people like George Fox, who founded the Quaker movement, and Saint Teresa, who founded a whole new monastic movement in Catholicism. And they were incredible experiences. George Fox saw blood pouring from the skies and gushing down the streets in flash floods of Lichfield in England. Saint Teresa was laying in her cold, dark stone bedroom at night in a nunnery, and she felt angels come through the walls and pierce her with a lance and set her on fire with the ecstasy of God and ride her up to way, way high above the earth, where she could see all of God's creation spread out, along with the wonder, astonishment, and joy of God within her. And what William James was trying to get across is, first of all, these experiences are worth looking at. It's important to bring them into the realm of science. And he said, these experiences are psychopathological. But in the case of some people, psychopathology can be an engine of history. Precisely what I was after the engines of history. And searching for those gods inside became crucial to understanding my clients. And it took me 6 years with my own company to work out what I called secular shamanism. And if you came and asked me to represent you, I gave you a little speech. And I said, look, if you expect me to fashion an artificial mask for you and then sit here like a guy in a plaid suit flicking a cigar and say, kid, with this image, I'm going to make you a star, then you've come to the wrong person. I'll get you an appointment with my best competitor. You'll be in his office in 2 hours, if that's what you want. If you're going to work for me, you have to understand that music is not about an exchange of pieces of plastic. It is not about an exchange of downloads. It is not even about an exchange of money. It is an exchange of human soul. And if you want me to work with you, then you're going to have to give me 6 weeks to study everything you've ever written, everything that's ever been written about you, every album cover you've ever put out, and establish and create a preliminary biography of you, then come out to wherever your environment is and spend between 1 and 3 days with you alone, no managers, no assistants, no wives, just you and me. What was my job? My job was to find your story, but there's something important that makes a story important, and that is to find the gods inside of you. Now, and then to keep you focused on those gods, to keep you from straying from the gods inside of you. Those are your passion points. Those are the things that power you. When you sit in front of a blank sheet of paper or a blank computer screen at 2 p.m. and you're on deadline for an album and you have to write lyrics, and you know in your heart you cannot write lyrics. You don't even believe that you wrote any of the previous lyrics that you've written in the past. And yet by 4 p.m. on a reasonably good day, there's a lyric in front of you. And once or twice in your life, that lyric is so perfect, it felt like it wrote itself through you. My job is to find the gods inside of you that wrote those lyrics. Now, when you go on stage on a night of a really good performance and you see the eyes of the audience widening, you see even their pupils dilating, you see their faces melting, you see them melting into a common blob of energy like a giant amoeba. You feel that amoeba reach a pseudopod out to you like a tunnel and send its energy, the energy of anywhere from 700 to 70,000 people flowing through you. You become an empty pipe. That energy goes up through you to someplace around here, and it's utterly transmogrified and poured back down to the audience, and you have an out-of-body experience. You feel like you're watching this whole thing from the ceiling. You feel like you're being danced by like a marionette. My job is to find the gods inside you that danced you for those 70 minutes on stage. And that became my job. To give you an example of how it worked, one day I got a call from John Mellencamp, and it was one of my favorite clients to work with. And John said, look, I've just been offered $125 million by Heinz Ketchup. Well, no, $1.25 million, sorry, by Heinz Ketchup. Because in those days, Heinz Ketchup came only in glass bottles. The plastic freeze bottle was off in the distant horizon. And because it came in glass bottles and was so thick, you'd get a hamburger, you'd turn the ketchup upside down over the hamburger, you'd shake the bottle up and down, and nothing would happen. The ketchup wouldn't move. By the time you used your knife and you pulled the ketchup out of the bottle, by the time you were finished fighting with the bottle, your hamburger was cold. So Heinz decided to make a virtue out of this vice. And they used Carly Simon's song Anticipation. And it worked great. It was terrific. And now they wanted to use John Mellencamp's Hurt So Good. And so John said, what should I do? And I said, John, in 15 years, what do you want to be doing? Do you want to be collecting the returns on your investments? Or do you want to be performing in front of an audience with your music? And John said, I want to be in front of my audience with my music. I said, then you have to turn down the ketchup commercial. Why? Because imagine the city of Jerusalem back in the days of Isaiah the prophet, and it has high impenetrable walls and only a very narrow gate to let you in. And it has guards at the gate.
Mm-hmm.
And you, John, are outside those gates. You're out in the wilderness. And to the folks having dinner parties back in the walled city, you're a nothing. But you stand out there and you raise your fist and you say, I am somebody. I am an identity. I have a right to exist.
Mm-hmm.
Kids, when they're 12 years old, their hormones and their parents' hormones clash. And they are basically tossed out of the family and have to establish a whole new identity. And they are out in precisely that kind of wilderness. And when you raise your fist and say, I have a right to be, you are saying, I have a right to be on behalf of all of those kids and any of the rest of us who feel outside of society and like rebelling. If you accept that ketchup commercial, you will enter the gates of the city, you will be at the dinner parties, you will cease to be the voice of those of us who feel we don't have a voice. So John turned down the ketchup commercial. His manager was Billy Gaff, who managed Rod Stewart in those days. And Billy Gaff basically was most interested in his racehorses. When John turned the ketchup commercial down, Billy Gaff quit. John called and said, who can I get as a manager? I had a very good relationship working with a guy named Tommy Mottola, who managed Hall & Oates in those days and would eventually run Sony Records. And I advised John to go with Tommy because Tommy has a good delivery apparatus, but not necessarily a sense of strategy. And John and I had a sense of strategy. So, and then Tommy Mottola eventually wrote a book and saying that working with John Mellencamp was the most miserable experience of his life.
Wow.
But the most important example of finding the gods inside of somebody was Michael Jackson.
Mm-hmm.
And the Michael Jackson experience was absolutely astonishing. The Jacksons pursued me for 4 months. They wanted me to work with them. They were about to do a tour with their brother Michael, the first one in 3 years,
Wow.
the Victory Tour. And Michael had just become huge. He just sold 36 million copies of just one album, which was far more than anybody else had ever sold. And he had become bigger than Elvis Presley and the Beatles combined, literally. And I kept telling him, no, you don't need me. Michael's name is so big that you get a talking dog to say Michael Jackson. And any magazine editor anywhere in the country will give you a cover in exchange for the interview. But they persisted. And then one day they called and said, the Jacksons want to meet with you. They're coming into New York City. Now, Brooke, I didn't grow up around other humans. Kids wanted nothing to do with me in Buffalo, New York, nothing at all. I grew up with guinea pigs and lab rats in my bedroom and guppies. So I never learned the basic social habits, the courtesies of society. But I had heard this phrase that if you have to say no to somebody, you have to say no to them to their face.
Mm-hmm.
So I took the meeting. I went into Manhattan on a Saturday night at midnight and went up to the second top floor of the Helmsley Palace. And I went to the gilt door with the address that I'd been given and I knocked. And the door opened 3 inches. And when it opened 3 inches, I realized I was going to have to say yes.
Aw.
There was an old ad that used to run for TDK cake tapes or something like that. And it's a guy sitting in a great big armchair with long hair. And they must have a fan on him that's going 120 miles an hour. And his hair is flying straight backwards. And he's plastered up against the seat. Well, the 4 Jacksons were lined up against the wall. And that's exactly what they looked like. And you could feel that there was a malevolent force, a dark force, a demonic force in the room. There was some sort of serious trouble here. And that's not the job for a talking dog. That's a job for me. I love crusading on behalf of people who deserve it. So I said yes. A few months later, I was out at Marlon Jackson's pool house in Encino, California. And a pool house is a little building just big enough for one reasonable sized room on the first floor and another room exactly the same size on the second floor. And on the first floor, the room was dominated by a pool table in the center, and around the sides of the room were arcade games, which no real human could possibly afford even one of them, much less a whole wall lined with them. And the Jacksons were talking about merchandising. So the pool table was just filled with T-shirts and jackets and stuff like that. And I was lecturing the Jacksons on the fact that you try to put together the most astonishing shows in the world. So your merchandising has to reflect that. Your T-shirts have to be the most astonishing in the world. Your tour jackets have to be the most astonishing in the world. And as I was concluding the lecture, now I'm standing there with two Jacksons on either side of me at the center of the table. And there's another ritual I had been taught when I was in Israel when I was 19 years old. I lived there for 13 months. And somebody had taught me that when there's somebody entering a room that everybody wants you to meet, you walk up to that person, you stick out your hand, you say, "Hi, my name is Howard." And the other person sticks out his hand and says, "Hi, my name is fill in the blank." So I heard the screen door opening, and Michael was due. And I walked over to the screen door, and I stuck out my hand. I had never done this before. And I said, "Hi, my name is Howard." Now, I'd read a stack of articles on Michael this thick. And every single article agreed that Michael Jackson was a bubble baby, that he was afraid of contact with other human beings, that if you reached out a hand to touch him, he would shrink away in fear. That is not what happened, Brooke. Michael put his hand out. He gave me a handshake. It was a mild handshake. It wasn't like Donald Trump trying to crush you and demonstrate his power over you. And he said, "Hi, my name is Michael." It was lovely. And I said, "I've got a press release to read to you. Where can we do it?" And he took me up the stairs to the room on the second floor. And that room was piled to the ceiling with keyboards and amplifiers. So Michael found a spot on one amplifier. I found a spot on another amplifier. Now, you've got to remember, I had been working on my writing since I was 12 years old, and Albert Einstein had told me to work on it. I'd worked on my poetry. I'd worked on my prose. I had worked on every form of writing I could do. To me, writing was not just a way to communicate clearly. It was a high art. And I had done something that no other PR company president did. At first, I had used writers to write the stuff. And then I realized the vision of who this person is in my mind. And in order to get it across, I'm going to have to write it, because the material, the written material, is going to be the ammunition that my account executives use in order to tell the story of this artist to the people in the press. And that story is in me. I have to put it down myself. So I was the only PR company head who wrote all of his own press releases and all of his own bios. So I'm sitting on an amplifier, Michael's sitting on another amplifier. I read the first two sentences of the press release, and Michael begins to slump in his seat, and he goes, "Oh." And then I get another two sentences, and he goes, "Oh." And I get another two sentences, and he goes, "Oh." And when I come to the end, Michael says, "Man, that's beautiful. Did you write that?" He was the only person in my entire career in publicity who ever saw the underlying art in the materials I was putting together. He was astonishing. Then we went downstairs because there was a meeting coming up with the art director from Columbia Records for the album cover of their next album together. And she came in carrying 5 portfolios. Now remember, Brooke, I had co-founded an art studio, and my job was to carry that portfolio out to the world. So these were 5 portfolios but they were not like the portfolio I carried. The one I carried was vinyl, black vinyl. These were hand-tooled leather and hand-tooled cherry wood. And I recognized the names of many of the artists because they were legends in the art business when I was in the art business. And she slid the first portfolio across the table, and it was for Michael Whalen, who's an absolutely astonishing fantasy artist, living in Connecticut. He's just amazing, breathtaking. And the brothers are standing on either side of us. Michael and I are standing next to each other. My right shoulder is up against Michael's left shoulder. My right elbow is up against Michael's left elbow. And my right knee is up against Michael's left knee. So Michael starts to open the first page of the portfolio, and he only gets a square inch into it. And his knees begin to buckle. And he goes, oh. And he opens it another inch. Oh, 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 oh. They're right next to me. Michael was having an aesthetic orgasm. And I've never seen that in a fellow human being at all. Now, let me take you back to when I was 10 years old and what got me into science. One day I was in my family's living room and a book appeared in my lap. Now, you know how you know the location of every book your parents own because they all stay in the same place and they've been there since you came to consciousness. This is a book I'd never seen before, and it had no location on a shelf anywhere. I opened it and said, the first two rules of science are these: the truth at any price, including the price of your life. And it told the story of Galileo all wrong. It said Galileo would have been willing to go to the stake to defend his truth. Well, that's what I needed to hear at the age of 10, but 30 years later, I'd find out it wasn't true. Nonetheless, the first rule of science, the truth at any price, including the price of your life. The second rule of science, look at things right under your nose as if you've never seen them before, and then proceed from there. And the example was Anton von Leeuwenhoek, who invented the microscope. Those became my religion. Those were the reason I could be an atheist. They were it for me. The first rule is the rule of courage. The second rule is the rule of awe, wonder, and surprise. What was I watching or feeling through my elbow, through my shoulder, through my knee, in Michael's body language? Awe, wonder, and surprise on a level I had never imagined it could possibly exist in a human.
Wow.
That was the gods inside of Michael. That was one manifestation of them. Then I got a call a few months later saying, you've got to be out here by 4 o'clock tonight, or by 11 o'clock tonight. This is 4 in the afternoon in New York. Michael is canceling his tour, and you're the only one he will listen to. Now, imagine that, Brooke. There was a large pool of very talented people around Michael, and they're telling me I'm the only person Michael will listen to? That's very strange. Nonetheless, I got out to LA at 11 o'clock that night, took my rental car to the address I was told, which turned out to be a giant studio lot. A giant studio lot at night is an eerie place because it has all these aircraft carrier or aircraft hangar sized buildings, with big semicircular roofs. And those buildings are all empty, and the emptiness swallows any energy or joy that could possibly exist. And I found my way to the studio in which the Jacksons were performing, one of these big hangars. And I sat in the audience while they finished their rehearsal. Then we all filed out to a dressing trailer outside. And have you ever seen a dressing trailer? No. It's like this great big school bus, sort of, that's outfitted to be a dressing room. And it had red plastic seats, a banquette of red plastic seats opposite the door, another banquette opposite that banquette, in other words, on either side of this bus-size thing. And then there was a little banquette right next to the door, which was clearly the power seat, the throne. So Michael took the power seat, and I took the seat at his immediate left hand. And Michael explained to me why he was canceling the tour. He said, my brother Jackie came down with a bone chip in his knee a month ago. Well, I knew that because I had flown out to California to organize the press conference at the hospital. where we had explained the bone chip to the press. And he said the doctors felt that he would be better in time for the tour. He's not going to be better in time for the tour. My brother Jackie is the best dancer I have ever seen in my life and the best choreographer I have ever seen in my life. Now think about this. Michael Jackson was the highest level student of dance during our lifetimes. He had studied everybody from Fred Astaire to James Brown. And he had invented whole new forms of dance moves. And to say his brother Jackie is the best dancer he'd ever seen is a remarkable statement. And he explained that he would not go out in front of his audience without absolutely the best. That's why he was putting off the tour. And he also explained something else. The trouble in the room, when I had first met the Jacksons, came, among other things, from the fact that the press had been convinced by somebody, by a Darth Vader. They had been convinced that the Jacksons' victory tour tickets were going to be considerably higher in price than those of any other previous tour. And that it was because this was the last chance the Jackson brothers had to act like vampires and to suck in profit from the success of their brother to sustain their extravagant lifestyles. Michael explained why that wasn't true. And also, the press had been led to say, nobody we know is doing the staging. Nobody we know is doing the sound. Nobody we know is doing the lighting. And nobody we know is doing the security. So the stage is going to collapse. The sound system is going to electrocute the performers. The 7-story high lighting rigs are going to collapse on the heads of the audience and kill people. And because nobody we know is doing security, gangs will be running up and down the aisles with knives, disemboweling people. In other words, you dare not send your kids to this tour. And I learned why the press had gotten away with saying this, all of which is false. You know, Michael, by now you know from that story of the art portfolio, the level of Michael Jackson's awe, wonder, and surprise. Michael felt that this was a gift given to him by God. And as a consequence, his obligation in life was to give this gift to his kids, to his fans. And so he had found, when he was planning the tour a year and a half earlier, he had found the best stage people, the best sound people, the best lighting people, the best security people, and the best magicians. And he had signed them all to an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement. Why? Because he wanted to utterly surprise his kids with this tour. And as Michael's explaining all this, I can't get this across by imitation. He came across with the force of a prophet. And as he was speaking, he spoke with such intensity that I had the only visual vision of my lifetime. I've had about half a dozen visions. All of them have come true. But this was not like any other vision, because I saw Michael's ribs as golden gates. And I saw those golden gates swing open. And I saw 10,000 kids in there, Michael's kids, the kids he was working to protect. Well, I had to explain to him the simple fact that the tour had been getting tons and tons of negative press, that if Michael were to postpone his tour, it would validate the idea that the tour was totally amateur. And parents would not allow their kids to come to his shows. His kids would be missing from those audiences. If this was sort of like Moses going up against Muhammad, two prophets going up against each other, because both of us were possessed of a truth. And both of us were totally taken over by it. And Michael said yes to what I was telling him, to go on with the tour. So what did I learn in these two encounters with Michael? Michael was the living instantiation of of the second law of science.
Mm-hmm.
Look at things right under your nose as if you've never seen them before, and then proceed from there. The law of awe, wonder, and surprise.
Mm-hmm.
Michael was the living embodiment of the first rule of science, the truth at any price, including the price of your life. That was in his commitment to his audience, his utter, profound, marrow deep commitment to his audience. That commitment to his audience wasn't just something that he espoused, it
Mm-hmm.
was him. It was the very heart and soul of him.
That's
So
amazing.
that's what I mean by finding the gods inside.
Mm-hmm.
And Michael, in the book, in Einstein, Michael Jackson, and Me, A Search for
Mm-hmm.
Soul and Power Bits of Rock and Roll, I tell you a story. Back in 1954, there was a guy named Roger Bannister.
Mm-hmm.
At that point, every sports physiologist on the planet would tell you the same thing. It was physiologically impossible for a human being to beat the 4-minute mile. Roger Bannister was a med school student in England, and he and his best friend, another med school student, analyzed every move that he made and eliminated every little move that lost energy.
Mm-hmm.
And Roger Bannister did the impossible. He broke the 4-minute mile.
Wow.
Well, in doing that, he expanded the boundary of possibility for humanity. Since then, 1,800 people have broken the 4-minute mile. 1,800 people have done what the greatest experts on the planet deemed physiologically impossible for human beings. And what Roger Bannister did for running, Michael Jackson did for the first two rules of science. The truth at any price, including the price of your life, and look at things right under your nose as if you've never seen them before. He expanded the bounds of human possibility. He expanded the bounds of awe, wonder, and surprise, of human perception.
Mm-hmm.
But nobody's telling you this. And there were so many talented people around Michael that by the time I got around to writing this book, and Michael's glory years were 20 years in the past or more, I expected someone would have gotten this across.
Right.
And so far as I could see, nobody had. So
Mm-hmm.
I want you to feel what it's like to be with Michael,
Mm-hmm.
to feel what it's like to be inside of Michael,
Mm-hmm.
so that Michael's legacy becomes what it should be: the expansion of the boundaries of human possibility, the expansion of the boundaries of human perception.
Nice. Wow.
So
That's
that's the sort of
amazing.
thing that these are all adventures into the souls of some of the most interesting people of the last 50 years.
Wow.
And
That is amazing.
each soul is radically different.
That's amazing how you can like read people like that. Like, wow. I never
But
never
also,
thought.
remember, groups have souls too.
Mm-hmm.
And music is all about expressing the soul of groups as well.
Right.
And because groups have souls, that's what connects us to the forces of history. When an Adolf Hitler or a Donald Trump comes along, they are appealing to the soul of the group.
Right.
They have an ability like a musician playing a string of a cello. They have an ability to hit the chords of human passion. And unfortunately, both Adolf Hitler and Donald Trump hit the wrong chords.
Mm-hmm.
But those are deep chords in the human spirit, in the human soul. And my job was to come to understand these deep chords in the human soul. And John Mellencamp and Michael Jackson and Prince and Bob Marley and all of these people helped me do that in ways that no other science person. I went back to my science full time in 1988. I've now been published or given lectures at scholarly conferences in 12 different scientific fields, from quantum physics and cosmology to evolutionary biology, governance, and aerospace. And no other science person in my lifetime or possibly in history has ever had the privilege of not only working directly with some of the greatest souls,
Mm-hmm.
some of the most influential souls of his time, but I forget what the second half of that sentence was. But and then being able to take that experience back um, into the realm of science and think it out and think out what it means. And this book is really, it reads like an adventure. Many people who picked it up could not stop reading until they'd reached the end. Um, so you don't think there's a deeper level to it, but the deeper level is getting itself across to you.
Wow, that's amazing. I want to thank you so much, Howard, for coming on my podcast today.
Well, thanks, Brooke. It was a pleasure, and I wish I could pet your dog. And I wish I could pet the pussycat.
Oh, you have a great day.
Okay, thanks, Brooke.
Bye.
Bye.
Hey everyone. So I just had the wonderful, wonderful opportunity to interview Howard Bloom. I'm a huge, huge fan. So learning about science is something I'm not really into, but I like science a little bit, but he has a great message, what we discussed on this podcast. So I hope you all check out his book. It's called Einstein, Michael Jackson, and Me, A Search for Soul in the Power Pits of Rock and Roll. So I hope you all check that out. And it's on his website. I will link it to this specific interview. It's howardbloom.net. It's not howardbloom.com. It's howardbloom.net. And you can check out all of the other books he's published. You can check out his interviews, his other interviews. You can check out a plethora of things he has going on his website. I hope you all have a great day, make great choices, and thank you all so much for supporting and listening to my podcast. Have a great day.